Welcome back to Black Rose Stories, where we examine the psychology, evidence, and human consequences behind some of the darkest decisions people can make. Tonight, we are not looking at the mechanics of a killing. We are looking at the mind behind it. What makes someone decide that another human being should die? What happens psychologically when anger becomes obsession, when greed becomes justification, or when fear becomes a reason to cross a line that cannot be uncrossed? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, how can people convince themselves that ordering, arranging, or participating in a murder is somehow reasonable? The psychology behind a contract killing is rarely simple. There is no single personality type, no single motive, no single path. Some people are driven by money, others by revenge, some by fear, some by power, some by jealousy, and some by a combination of motives so tangled that even investigators struggle to separate them. But across many cases, one pattern appears again and again. Before a person can participate in deliberate violence, they often have to change the way they think about the victim. The victim stops being fully human in their mind. They become an obstacle, a threat, a debt, a problem, a symbol of humiliation, a person standing between them and something they desperately want. That psychological transformation is critical because most people possess powerful internal barriers against killing: empathy, morality, fear of consequences, attachment to social rules, recognition of another person's humanity. For extreme violence to become possible, one or more of those barriers must weaken. Sometimes that happens gradually. A person repeats the same grievance over and over. They convince themselves they have been betrayed. They describe the victim as evil. They tell others that their life would be better if the person disappeared. Each repetition strengthens the narrative. Eventually, the story becomes emotionally more important than reality. Psychologists sometimes describe this process through concepts such as moral disengagement. Moral disengagement does not mean that someone suddenly loses all understanding of right and wrong. Instead, they begin creating exceptions. They may still believe murder is wrong in general, but they convince themselves that this particular victim deserves it, or that this situation is different, or that they have no alternative. The mind begins building excuses before the crime ever occurs. That is one of the darkest abilities human beings possess. We can create moral rules, and then we can create stories that allow us to violate them. Imagine a fictional business owner who believes a former partner destroyed everything he built. At first, he says, "I hate him." Then, "He ruined my life." Then, "He deserves whatever happens." Then perhaps, "My family would be safe if he were gone." Notice what is happening. The language is changing. The victim is no longer described as a person. He is described as the source of every problem. This does not mean that everyone who speaks angrily will become violent. Most do not. People say extreme things during conflict and never act on them. But when investigators examine a planned crime afterward, they may look closely at escalating language because it can reveal how someone was thinking. The psychology of revenge is especially powerful. Revenge often begins with humiliation. Someone feels insulted, betrayed, rejected, cheated, embarrassed, powerless. And instead of processing that pain, they begin imagining punishment. At first, the fantasy may provide emotional relief. In imagination, they regain control. The person who hurt them is finally forced to suffer. But revenge has a psychological trap. The more someone thinks about it, the more central it can become. They replay the injury. Every replay increases anger. Every retelling makes the grievance feel fresh. What happened once begins happening again and again inside the mind. This cycle is known as rumination. Rumination is not the same thing as ordinary reflection. Healthy reflection can help people understand a painful experience and eventually move forward. Rumination keeps the wound open. The person repeatedly asks questions that have no satisfying answer. How could they do this to me? Why should they get away with it? Why am I the one suffering? The brain begins treating revenge as unfinished business. And for someone already vulnerable to violent thinking, revenge can start to feel like justice. That confusion is dangerous. Justice is governed by rules, evidence, due process, proportionality, accountability. Revenge is personal, emotional, unlimited. Its goal is not fairness. Its goal is satisfaction. And satisfaction through revenge is often much shorter-lived than people imagine. Another major motive is money. At first glance, Financial motives can seem emotionally colder. No dramatic betrayal. No romantic jealousy. No explosive hatred. Just calculation. But financial crimes also require psychological justification. A person might decide that another human life is worth less than an inheritance, an insurance payout, a business interest, or freedom from debt. That decision reveals something profound. The victim becomes an economic variable. Instead of asking, "What happens to this person?" the offender thinks, "What happens to me if this person is gone?" This extreme self-centeredness can appear in people with very different personalities. Some may have strong narcissistic traits. Others may simply be desperate. Some may feel trapped by debt. Others may believe they are entitled to wealth. Again, motive alone does not explain the entire person. People experiencing financial pressure overwhelmingly do not commit murder. But in certain cases, money becomes part of a larger psychological process. The individual begins believing that their future matters more than another person's existence. Entitlement can intensify this. Entitlement is the belief that one deserves special treatment, status, money, loyalty, or obedience. When highly entitled people encounter rejection, they may experience it not simply as disappointment, but as injustice. A spouse wants to leave. A business partner refuses a demand. A relative controls an inheritance. An employee exposes wrongdoing. The entitled person may think, "How dare they do this to me?" That phrase reveals an important mindset. The problem is not simply that something unwanted happened. The problem is that another person dared to resist. Control is often deeply connected to violence. Some offenders cannot tolerate losing control over another person. This may appear in abusive relationships. A partner says the relationship is over. For a healthy person, that may be painful, devastating, even life-changing. But they eventually accept that another human being has the right to leave. A controlling person may interpret departure as rebellion. They may believe the other person belongs to them. The mindset can become, "If I cannot have you, no one will." This phrase is sometimes romanticized in fiction. In reality, it reflects possession, not love. Love recognizes another person's autonomy. Possession denies it. That distinction matters enormously. Jealousy can also become a powerful psychological force. Ordinary jealousy is common. Most people experience it at some point. But extreme jealousy can distort perception. Every message becomes suspicious. Every delay becomes evidence. Every friendship becomes a threat. The jealous person may begin creating an elaborate story without sufficient evidence. They may become obsessed with imagined betrayal. And when jealousy combines with entitlement and control, the risk of dangerous behavior can increase. Still, investigators must be careful. A jealous person is not automatically violent. A controlling person is not automatically a murderer. Psychological characteristics can help explain behavior, but they should never replace evidence. That is one of the most important lessons in true crime. People are not convicted because they seem like the kind of person who could commit a crime. They should be convicted because reliable evidence proves they did. Another psychological factor sometimes found in organized violence is distance. Distance makes cruelty easier. A person who orders violence may never see the victim's final moments. They may never hear the fear, never see the family, never physically confront the consequences. That separation can reduce emotional resistance. It is easier to discuss violence abstractly than to confront what it actually means. Language often reflects this distancing. Instead of saying kill, someone might use vague language. Take care of the problem. Handle it. Make it disappear. Euphemisms matter because they soften reality. Human beings use euphemisms in many uncomfortable situations. We say someone passed away instead of died. We say a company is downsizing instead of saying people are losing jobs. Language creates emotional distance. In criminal contexts, euphemistic language can allow someone to discuss terrible actions without fully confronting them. This is another form of moral disengagement. Words become shields, but consequences remain real. The victim does not experience a euphemism. The victim experiences violence. Their family experiences grief. Their children experience absence. Their friends experience shock. Language cannot soften reality for them. This emotional distance also helps explain why group participation can be dangerous. Responsibility becomes divided. One person develops the grievance. Another introduces people. Another knows something. Another participates more directly. Each person may tell themselves, I am not the one responsible. This diffusion of responsibility appears throughout human psychology. When many people share responsibility, each individual may feel less personally accountable. We see mild versions of this in ordinary life. In a crowded place, people may be slower to help a stranger because everyone assumes someone else will act. In serious criminal behavior, that same psychological mechanism can take a far darker form. One participant says, "It wasn't my idea." Another says, "I never touched anyone." Another says, "I was only passing information." Each separates their action from the final consequence. But moral responsibility cannot always be divided so neatly. Small actions can contribute to enormous outcomes. This is one reason investigators reconstruct the role of each participant. Who knew what? When did they know it? What did they intend? What actions did they take? These questions matter both psychologically and legally. Another disturbing element is obedience. People sometimes participate in wrongdoing because someone more powerful tells them to. The person giving the order might be a gang leader, a criminal boss, a controlling partner, a wealthy employer, a family member, or simply someone the participant desperately wants to impress. Human beings are highly sensitive to hierarchy. We learn from childhood to obey authority. Parents, teachers, managers, institutions. Most of the time, obedience keeps society functioning. But obedience can become dangerous when someone stops evaluating whether the instruction itself is wrong. The participant tells themselves, "I was just doing what I was told." History has shown how powerful this defense can feel psychologically. But obedience does not erase agency. Adults remain responsible for recognizing serious harm. Still, understanding obedience helps explain why people sometimes participate in acts they would never have initiated on their own. Belonging can have a similar effect. Criminal organizations often create strong group identities. Members may begin seeing loyalty as more important than morality. The group becomes family. Outsiders become enemies. Rules inside the organization replace ordinary social rules. A person may commit acts for the group that they would never commit independently. This can be strengthened through gradual escalation. Rarely does a new participant begin with the most extreme act. They may first perform small favors, then larger ones, then illegal ones. Each step changes their internal boundary. Psychologists sometimes connect this to commitment and consistency. Once people have invested heavily in a group, they feel pressure to remain consistent with previous choices. Admitting the group is wrong also means admitting that earlier sacrifices may have been meaningless. That is psychologically painful. So they continue. The deeper they go, the harder it becomes to leave. Fear reinforces the cycle. Some participants may believe refusing an order will put them in danger. In those cases, the psychology becomes more complicated. Not everyone involved in a conspiracy necessarily acts with the same freedom. Some may be manipulated, some threatened, some financially dependent, some genuinely willing. Legal systems examine these distinctions carefully. Psychology helps explain behavior. It does not automatically excuse it. Another powerful factor is compartmentalization. Compartmentalization allows people to keep conflicting parts of their identity separate. Someone might be a loving parent at home, a respected employee at work, a friendly neighbor, and still participate in terrible behavior elsewhere. This seems impossible until we understand how effectively the mind can separate roles. The person does not necessarily think, "I am an evil person." Instead, they think, "This is something I have to do," or "This is business," or "This part of my life has nothing to do with my family." Human beings are remarkably skilled at protecting a positive self-image. Even people who commit serious crimes often find ways to see themselves as basically good. They blame circumstances, the victim, the system, their associates, anything except themselves. This is called self-serving bias. We tend to interpret our successes as evidence of our character and our failures as products of circumstance. In criminal behavior, that bias can become extreme. An offender may say, "I would never have done this if they hadn't betrayed me." Notice the shift. Responsibility moves from the person making the decision to the person they harmed. This is victim blaming at its most dangerous. Another psychological mechanism is dehumanization. When people repeatedly describe someone as worthless, evil, vermin, or less than human, violence can become emotionally easier. Dehumanization appears in interpersonal violence, organized crime, warfare, genocide, and many other forms of human cruelty. It works because empathy depends partly on recognizing similarity. We feel more concern for people we see as human beings like ourselves. Dehumanization breaks that connection. The victim becomes a category instead of an individual. But reality always returns. A target is someone's child, someone's friend, someone who once had a first day at school, someone who laughed at jokes, someone who made mistakes, someone who had plans for next week. The language of criminal violence hides those facts. True crime storytelling should restore them. Because without the victim's humanity, the story becomes entertainment about criminals. And the real story is about consequences. There is another personality feature often discussed in connection with severe violence: psychopathy. The term is frequently misunderstood. Popular culture uses psychopath as a synonym for murderer. That is inaccurate. Psychopathy refers to a constellation of personality traits that may include shallow affect, manipulativeness, lack of remorse, superficial charm, irresponsibility, and reduced empathy. Not everyone with psychopathic traits becomes violent, and not everyone who commits murder is psychopathic. This distinction is important. Violence is produced by combinations of personality, environment, circumstance, opportunity, social influence, and choice. There is no single murder gene or universal criminal personality. However, certain traits can make some forms of exploitation easier. A person with extremely low empathy may experience fewer emotional barriers when harming others. A highly manipulative person may be effective at recruiting participants. Someone with grandiose narcissism may believe ordinary rules do not apply to them. But traits exist on continuums, and psychological assessment requires trained professionals, not social media diagnosis. Calling every cruel person a psychopath may sound dramatic. It does not help us understand behavior. Another factor that appears repeatedly is overconfidence. People who plan serious crimes may believe they are smarter than investigators. They imagine they have anticipated everything. This belief can be reinforced if they have successfully lied or manipulated people before. Someone who has gotten away with fraud might believe they can get away with something far more serious. A person who dominates their family may assume they can dominate witnesses. A powerful executive may believe money can solve every problem. A criminal leader may believe fear guarantees silence. Success creates confidence. Confidence can become arrogance. Arrogance creates mistakes. From a psychological perspective, overconfidence is incredibly common. Most people overestimate their abilities in at least some areas. But when the stakes involve homicide, that bias can have catastrophic consequences. An offender may believe everyone involved will remain loyal. They underestimate fear. They underestimate guilt. They underestimate technology. They underestimate investigators. They underestimate chance. And they underestimate how difficult it is to keep multiple people telling the same lie. This is where psychology and investigation intersect. A conspiracy depends on human behavior. Human behavior is unpredictable. Participants panic. They become suspicious. They feel cheated. They change relationships. They start families. They find religion. They develop guilt. They get arrested for unrelated crimes. They decide cooperation is better than loyalty. The mastermind can plan many things. They cannot control another person's conscience 10 years later. That instability is one reason organized crimes can unravel. Another fascinating psychological moment occurs after the violence. Before the crime, someone may imagine that success will bring relief. The problem will be gone. The money will arrive. The threat will disappear. The humiliation will be avenged. But reality after violence can be very different. Now the individual must live with uncertainty. Did someone see something? Did a participant talk? What evidence exists? Are police watching? Why did that person call? Why did someone stop responding? Every unexpected event can become frightening. The same crime that was supposed to create control now creates permanent anxiety. This can lead to hypervigilance, paranoia, insomnia, substance abuse, conflict between participants, erratic decisions. Some offenders become obsessed with news coverage. They want to know what investigators know. Others avoid coverage entirely. Some behave normally. Others become visibly distressed. There is no universal post-crime behavior, and that is why investigators should never diagnose guilt from nervousness alone. Innocent people can also become terrified during an investigation. But psychological pressure can expose existing fractures in a conspiracy. Suppose several people were involved. Each one wonders who is being investigated. They do not know what police have discovered. Uncertainty becomes powerful. If one participant believes another has already cooperated, loyalty may collapse. This creates the prisoner's dilemma. In game theory, the prisoner's dilemma describes a situation in which individuals may benefit collectively from cooperation, but each has a personal incentive to betray the other. Criminal conspiracies are full of this tension. If everyone remains silent, perhaps the evidence remains incomplete. But if one person believes another might cooperate, they may decide to cooperate first. Now imagine this psychological pressure continuing for days, weeks, months. Trust begins to decay, and trust is the oxygen of conspiracy. Without it, the structure suffocates. Money can accelerate the collapse. People who commit crimes for payment may not possess genuine loyalty to one another. Their relationship is transactional. Transactional relationships remain stable only while everyone believes the exchange is fair. If someone feels underpaid, exploited, or exposed to greater risk, resentment begins. A participant might ask, "Why am I protecting someone who does not care about me?" Self-interest returns. The same self-interest that helped create the crime can eventually help destroy the conspiracy. Fear works the same way. Threats can enforce silence temporarily, but fear is not loyalty. A frightened witness may stay quiet today. Tomorrow, police protection, changed circumstances, or simple exhaustion may alter the calculation. Criminal power often looks stronger from the outside than it actually is. Inside, it may depend on everyone pretending not to be afraid. Another fascinating issue is cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is the discomfort we experience when our actions conflict with our beliefs. Suppose someone believes, "I am a good person," then they participate in something terrible. The mind faces a contradiction. One solution would be to admit, "I did something deeply wrong," but that can be psychologically devastating. So the person may change the story instead. "The victim deserved it. I had no choice. Everyone else was doing it. I was only helping a friend. It wasn't supposed to go that far." Each explanation reduces internal discomfort. The action stays the same. The interpretation changes. This is why confessions, when they occur, are not always clean admissions of responsibility. People may confess while still minimizing. They accept 10% and deny 90%. They admit an action but deny intent. They blame another participant. They present themselves as manipulated. Some of those claims may be true. Some may be self-protection. Investigators must compare them against evidence. Another important psychological component is fantasy. Before serious crimes, some offenders may spend extensive time imagining outcomes. Fantasy allows people to experience emotional rewards without reality. They imagine revenge, power, freedom, money, control. The imagined result can become so vivid that the real-world consequences disappear from consideration. This is called temporal discounting. Human beings tend to value immediate rewards more strongly than distant consequences. The emotional satisfaction of revenge feels immediate. A future prison sentence feels abstract. The money feels immediate. The possibility of being caught feels distant. This bias influences many ordinary decisions. We eat unhealthy food because pleasure is immediate and health consequences are distant. We spend money now even though we know we should save. In criminal decision-making, temporal discounting can become disastrous. The mind focuses on what happens next week, not what life looks like 10 years later. Prison, family separation, public exposure, victims' families, regret. The future remains invisible until it arrives. This is why rational choice explanations of crime are incomplete. People do not always make perfectly rational calculations. They are emotional, biased, impulsive, overconfident. They misunderstand probability. They underestimate consequences. A crime that looks calculated may still contain enormous irrationality. Think about the contradiction. Someone may spend weeks trying to control details, yet the fundamental decision itself may be catastrophically irrational. They are risking decades of freedom to solve a problem that might have had legal alternatives. Divorce, litigation, bankruptcy, resignation, relocation, therapy, security, police intervention, walking away. None of those choices may feel satisfying in a moment of rage, but they preserve life, and they preserve possibility. Violence destroys possibility. Once the act occurs, every future choice becomes narrower. There is no undo button, no apology that restores a life, no financial settlement that repairs grief, no explanation that gives children their parent back. That is why the psychological process before violence matters. Prevention exists in that space. Before fantasy becomes action, before resentment becomes commitment, before someone convinces themselves that there is no alternative. There is almost always an alternative. Walking away can feel like losing. It may actually be the strongest decision available. Seeking psychological help can feel like admitting weakness. It may prevent irreversible harm. Reporting a credible threat can feel uncomfortable. It may save a life. Leaving an abusive or controlling environment can be frightening. Support services and authorities can help create safer options. The point is not that every conflict is easily solved. Some are incredibly painful. Some involve genuine danger. Some involve financial ruin. Some involve betrayal that changes a person's entire life. But murder does not restore what was lost. It multiplies loss. This is one reason the psychology of contract killing is so tragic. At almost every stage, there are moments where a different decision could have changed everything. The person with the grievance could seek help. The person approached to participate could refuse. An intermediary could report what they heard. A friend could take a threat seriously. A potential victim could receive protection. A participant could withdraw. Someone could speak before violence occurs rather than after. Every one of these moments represents an exit. And the farther people travel down the path, the harder exit becomes psychologically. Commitment increases. Fear increases. Shame increases. People begin thinking, I have already gone too far. This is known as the sunk cost effect. We often continue bad decisions because we have already invested time, money, or reputation. But previous mistakes do not require future mistakes. The rational decision may be to stop. In serious criminal situations, stopping and contacting qualified legal authorities may prevent further harm. The mind sometimes tells people that retreat is impossible. That is another illusion. There is another uncomfortable truth. Not everyone involved in violence feels immediate remorse. Some people feel little. Some remain convinced they were justified. Some focus entirely on avoiding punishment. Human empathy varies. Personality varies. But even when remorse is absent, consequences remain. A person does not have to feel guilty for evidence to exist. They do not have to regret the crime for witnesses to speak. They do not have to fear morally for the justice system to respond. Psychology can explain. It cannot erase reality. And perhaps that is the central lesson of tonight's story. Contract killing is often presented as the coldest kind of crime. A transaction, a decision separated from emotion. But beneath the surface, emotion is everywhere. Greed, fear, humiliation, anger, jealousy, entitlement, loyalty, insecurity, desperation, pride. Even the desire for money is often connected to emotional needs. Status, security, power, recognition. The crime may look transactional. The psychology rarely is. And once several people are involved, those emotions interact. One person is greedy. Another is afraid. Another wants approval. Another wants revenge. Another simply follows. The conspiracy becomes a machine built from unstable human parts. At first, everyone moves in the same direction. Then pressure arrives, and the machine begins breaking apart. One participant lies to another. Another panics. Someone demands more money. Someone feels ignored. Someone remembers the victim was a real person. Someone talks. The structure collapses because it was never as strong as it looked. This is why the mythology of the emotionless professional is often misleading. Even highly experienced criminals are human beings. They experience stress. They make assumptions. They misjudge people. They become careless. They develop relationships. They get older. Their priorities change. They cannot permanently control everyone around them. That is the weakness hidden inside every conspiracy. Control is temporary. Human beings change, and evidence can wait. For investigators, understanding psychology can help generate questions. Why would this person act? Why now? What relationship mattered? What changed before the crime? Who had influence? Who had fear? Who had financial pressure? But psychological theories must always remain subordinate to facts. A compelling motive is not proof. A strange personality is not proof. A lack of emotion is not proof. A criminal history is not proof of a new crime. Evidence must carry the case. This protects everyone. It protects innocent people from being convicted because they seem suspicious, and it makes legitimate prosecution stronger. True crime audiences should remember this too. It is easy to diagnose people from a documentary clip. A suspect looks cold. A spouse seems strange. A witness appears nervous. But human behavior under trauma and pressure is unpredictable. The person who appears calm may be in shock. The person who cries may still be deceptive. There is no facial expression that proves murder. There is no body language trick that replaces forensic evidence. The psychology worth studying is broader. How do grievances grow? How does moral disengagement happen? How do people justify harm? How does group loyalty overpower conscience? How do fear and self-interest destroy criminal trust? Those questions help us understand human behavior without pretending we can read minds. And understanding matters. Not because criminals deserve admiration, because prevention begins with recognizing how dangerous thinking develops. A grievance does not have to become revenge. Jealousy does not have to become possession. Financial desperation does not have to become violence. Humiliation does not have to become obsession. People can choose another path. They can speak to someone, leave the environment, seek counseling, contact authorities when threats become credible, use legal systems, protect themselves without harming others. There may be no perfect solution, but there are solutions that do not end with a body, a courtroom, and multiple families destroyed. That is the tragedy hidden behind so many cases. The person believed there was only one answer. There were many. They simply refused to see them. When investigators later reconstruct the psychology, they are often studying that narrowing of perception. The offender begins with a world full of options. Slowly, they eliminate them. Negotiation feels impossible. Walking away feels humiliating. Legal action feels too slow. Acceptance feels unbearable. Eventually, violence is presented internally as the only remaining solution. But that is rarely reality. It is tunnel vision. Extreme emotion narrows attention. Anger does this. Fear does this. Obsession does this. The mind becomes focused on one outcome. This is why time can be protective. Strong emotions change. The decision that feels necessary tonight may look horrifying tomorrow. Distance helps restore perspective. Professional support can restore alternatives. Removing access to the person or situation causing escalation can reduce immediate risk. In moments of dangerous fixation, delaying action may literally save lives. And for anyone who becomes aware that another person is making specific, credible threats, the safest response is not to investigate personally or confront them recklessly. Contact appropriate authorities or trained professionals. Let people equipped for threat assessment evaluate the situation. That is not overreaction. It is risk management. A threat does not prove someone will act. But credible threats deserve serious attention. Because after violence happens, everyone asks the same painful question. Were there signs? Sometimes there were. Sometimes there were not. Sometimes the signs looked ordinary until hindsight changed them. That is why prevention is difficult. But difficulty does not make it impossible. Families, friends, workplaces, mental health professionals, law enforcement, and communities all play roles. Early intervention matters. And there is one more psychological force we should talk about. Shame. Shame differs from guilt. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, I am wrong. Healthy guilt can motivate accountability. Severe shame can make people hide, deny, blame, or attack. A person who cannot tolerate shame may become extremely defensive when confronted. They may retaliate against someone exposing wrongdoing. They may seek to destroy the person who represents humiliation. This can appear in domestic violence, workplace retaliation, organized crime, and many other contexts. The individual is not merely avoiding consequences. They are trying to destroy the mirror. The victim reminds them of failure. So instead of changing themselves, they try to eliminate the reminder. Again, this is not rational. It is emotionally driven. And that is why understanding emotional regulation is so important. The ability to experience humiliation, rejection, anger, and loss without becoming violent is one of the foundations of a functioning society. We teach children that frustration does not justify hitting. Adults face the same principle at higher stakes. Power does not create an exemption. Money does not create an exemption. Status does not create an exemption. Pain does not create an exemption. You can be deeply hurt and still be responsible for what you choose next. That responsibility is the thread connecting psychology to justice. Circumstances can influence behavior. Trauma can influence behavior. Personality can influence behavior. Groups can influence behavior. But influence is not always destiny. The law examines responsibility. Psychology examines the forces shaping choices. Together, they provide a fuller picture. And sometimes that picture is deeply uncomfortable. Because the person behind a terrible crime may not look like a monster. They may look ordinary. They may have friends, a family, a job. They may laugh, celebrate birthdays, help neighbors. This is unsettling because we want evil to look visibly different. We want dangerous people to announce themselves. Reality is more complicated. Human beings can contain contradictions. Kindness in one area does not erase cruelty in another. That is why judging character from appearances is unreliable. Actions matter. Evidence matters. Patterns matter. And choices matter most. A person can spend years building a respectable life and destroy it with one irreversible decision. That destruction spreads outward. The victim loses everything. The offender may lose freedom. Families on both sides suffer. Children inherit trauma. Communities become afraid. Investigators spend years reconstructing the damage. Courtrooms fill. And all of it may begin with a grievance that someone refused to release. Think about that. A thought becomes a story. The story becomes an obsession. The obsession becomes justification. Justification becomes conversation. Conversation becomes commitment. And commitment can become catastrophe. At every stage, psychology is present. But at every stage before the final act, so is choice. That is why understanding these cases should do more than satisfy curiosity. It should teach us something about escalation. When people repeatedly feed hatred, hatred grows. When they constantly dehumanize another person, empathy shrinks. When they surround themselves only with people who validate revenge, distorted thinking becomes stronger. When they treat anger as identity, they become trapped inside it. The opposite is also true. Distance can weaken obsession. Perspective can weaken anger. Accountability can weaken entitlement. Empathy can restore another person's humanity. Support can restore choices. The mind is not fixed. It can escalate toward violence. It can also move away from it. That may be the most important psychological fact in this entire story. People can change direction, even after terrible thoughts, even after conversations they regret, even after becoming involved with dangerous people. The path can still change before irreversible harm occurs. And once violence has happened, accountability becomes necessary. But before it happens, prevention is still possible. That is where society should focus more attention, not only on catching people afterward, but on understanding how dangerous situations develop beforehand. Because the psychology behind a contract killing is not really about a mysterious category of people. It is about familiar human emotions pushed into extreme, distorted forms. Anger without regulation. Pride without humility. Fear without perspective. Greed without conscience. Loyalty without morality. Pain without healthy coping. Control without respect. These emotions exist in ordinary life. What matters is what people do with them. Most people experience anger and do not kill. Most people experience jealousy and do not become violent. Most people lose money and do not seek revenge. Most people are betrayed and eventually rebuild. That fact matters. It reminds us that emotion does not dictate behavior. Choice does. So when we ask what kind of person participates in a planned killing, perhaps the better question is not, what monster would do this? The better question is, what sequence of beliefs, relationships, emotions, and decisions allowed this person to cross the line? That question gives us something useful. It gives investigators motives to examine. It gives psychologists patterns to study. It gives communities warning signs to consider. And it gives ordinary people a reminder that extreme emotions should be managed before they become extreme actions. The darkness does not usually arrive all at once. It grows through permission. Permission to hate. Permission to obsess. Permission to dehumanize. Permission to justify. Permission to take one more step. Until someone reaches a place they once believed they would never go. And that is why the earlier step matters. The moment someone realizes their anger is becoming dangerous is not a moment of weakness. It is a moment to seek help. The moment someone receives a credible threat is not a moment to prove toughness. It is a moment to prioritize safety. The moment someone is asked to participate in serious violence is not a test of loyalty. It is a warning to refuse, disengage, and contact appropriate authorities. There is no honor in helping destroy a life. There is no victory in becoming part of another family's grief. And no payment is worth exchanging your future for a prison cell. This is the psychology that crime mythology often hides. A planned killing may begin with promises of control, loyalty, money, or revenge. It often ends with fear, betrayal, evidence, prosecution, guilt, and permanent loss. The fantasy and the reality are almost never the same. And perhaps that is why these stories remain so haunting. They force us to confront how far human beings can travel from ordinary morality when they repeatedly justify the next step. But they also remind us that every step before the final act is a place where the direction can change. The human mind can rationalize terrible things. It can also recognize them. It can ask for help. It can walk away. It can choose not to become the person it was becoming. That choice may never become a headline. No documentary will be made about the murder that did not happen. No courtroom will hear testimony. No true crime channel will reconstruct the case. A family will simply continue living. And that is the better ending. Here on Black Rose Stories, we tell dark stories because darkness reveals the importance of choices made before consequences become irreversible. The psychology behind a contract killing is not a blueprint for violence. It is a warning about what happens when grievance replaces reason, when people become objects, and when someone mistakes destruction for a solution. Because no matter how carefully violence is rationalized, another person remains a person. No matter how distant the decision feels, the consequences are real. And no matter how powerful someone believes they are, no one controls every witness, every record, every participant, every future decision, or every piece of evidence. The mind may create excuses. Reality does not. And eventually, reality has a way of returning. Sometimes through guilt, sometimes through betrayal, sometimes through investigation, sometimes through a courtroom, but always through consequences. This is Black Rose Stories, where behind every dark crime, we search not only for what happened, but for the human decisions that made it possible. And tonight's final thought is simple. Violence often begins long before the physical act. It begins when someone gives themselves permission to stop seeing another person as human. The most important intervention may be to reverse that process before it goes any further. Because once the final line is crossed, psychology can explain the decision. It cannot undo it.